We will continue our lecture on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy with the assassination. At the end of the 11-mile motorcade parade route, which had traveled a substantial portion on the main street of Dallas, the parade headed directly towards an area known as Daley Plaza, which is a handout you have received. When the motorcade traveling down Main Street reached Houston Street, the parade took a right turn toward a building known in history as the Texas School Book Depository. It was a warehouse that supplied textbooks to schools across the South. At 12:29 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, after traveling on Houston Street for a short distance, the presidential limousine passed a building known as the Dallas County Courthouse. At this point, Nellie Connolly, wife of Governor Connolly, turned to President Kennedy and said the following, quote, "Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." After traveling on Houston Street, the motorcade was scheduled to make a left turn onto Elm Street. And the turn on Elm Street would make it much more convenient for the parade route and the parade to capture Stemmons Freeway, which was an exit that would take the president to the Trademark where he was going to give his luncheon speech. Well, the motorcade continued down Houston Street and then made a 120-degree left turn onto Elm Street, which actually slowed the president's limousine down to approximately 11 miles per hour. The motorcade then headed down Elm Street toward a grassy incline to the right of the president that's now known as the Grassy Knoll, which is on your ID sheet. Suddenly, at 12:30 p.m., 3 shots rang out in Daley Plaza, and these shots would forever change the course of history. According to historians and the Warren Report, which was an investigation that President Lyndon Johnson had done after President Kennedy's assassination, this is the order of the 3 shots fired at Daley Plaza. This is a non-conspiracy historical fact. The first shot was fired from above and to the right of the president's limousine. The first bullet hit President Kennedy in the back. It was traveling downward at a 17-degree angle, and it traveled through the president and exited out his throat. President Kennedy immediately then lifted both hands up to his throat toward the exit wound. The bullet then continued through President Kennedy's body, and it entered Governor Connolly at the back rear of his right armpit. The bullet continued through Connolly's body. It shattered his 5th rib and ended up exiting out the right side of his chest, and then actually struck his right wrist and then lodged itself in his left thigh. That was shot number 1. The second shot missed the presidential limousine and hit the cement curb in front of the triple underpass, which was actually was an overpass in which Stemmons Freeway went through, but it hit a curb at the bottom of the triple underpass. A car salesman from Dallas by the name of James Tagg, who is on your ID sheet, was standing by the triple underpass directly in front of the motorcade. In other words, the motorcade would have been coming this way toward him, and he was standing by the curb watching the president's limousine come at him. Well, Tagg was nicked in the face by a fragment of cement from the bullet that hit the curb in front of him. The third shot. This was the most fatal shot. It hit the president in the back of the head. And Patrolman Corson, who we talked about, one of the Dallas police officers on motorcycle next to the limousine, was less than 6 feet from the president, and he was later quoted as saying, quote, "I knew something bad was wrong." Patrolman James Cheney, who was near Corson, and also less than 6 feet from the president on his motorcycle, was later quoted as saying his head exploded in blood. After the third shot, Jackie Kennedy began to climb out the back of the limousine. She climbed out the back of the limousine to retrieve a piece of the president's skull, which had landed on the back deck of the presidential limousine. Mrs. Kennedy was immediately met by Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had leaped onto the back of the car pushing Mrs. Kennedy back down inside the limousine. Now, Hill nearly fell from the limousine several times, and if he would have fallen, he would have been run over by the Secret Service vehicle that was closely following the president. Hill pushed Mrs. Kennedy down into the limousine and provided a human shield for the Kennedys as the limousine began a race to nearby Parkland Hospital, which was some 77 blocks away, or approximately 4.6 miles from the scene of the assassination. Concerning these shots, Mrs. Kennedy was later quoted as saying, "I heard these terrible noises, and my husband never made a sound. He had this sort of quizzical look on his face. I remember thinking he just looked as if he had had a slight headache. I remember falling on top of him and saying, 'Oh my God, they have shot my husband. And I love you, Jack.' I remember I was shouting." Secret Service agent Hill was later quoted as saying, "I heard a noise. I saw President Kennedy grab at himself and lurch forward. Mrs. Kennedy jumped from the seat. When she noticed that I was trying to climb on the car, she turned toward me, and I grabbed her and put her back in the back seat and lay there." Governor Connolly, who I mentioned also was hit in the shooting, was later quoted as saying, "Strangely, I had but one thought. This is an assassination attempt. When I was hit, I said, 'Oh, no, no, no.' And then I said, 'My God, they're going to kill us all.'" Kennedy aide Kenneth O'Donnell, who was traveling in the Secret Service car immediately behind the presidential limousine, later wrote, "After the second shot, David Powers said to me, 'Kenny, I think the president's been shot.' I made a quick sign of the cross. While we both stared at the president, a third shot took the side of his head off. We saw pieces of bone and brain tissue and bits of reddish hair flying through the air. The impact lifted him and shook him limply, as if he were a rag doll, and then he dropped out of our sight, sprawled across the back of the car." Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood, who was assigned to President Johnson, who's on your ID sheet, was later quoted as saying, "I turned instinctively in my seat, and with my left hand I grasped Lyndon Johnson's right shoulder, and with all the leverage I could exert from a sitting position, I forced him downward. 'Get down,' I shouted, 'get down.' The Vice President reacted immediately. Still not seeing the source of the explosion, I swung across the back seat and sat on top of him." At 12:33 p.m., a telephone rang in the emergency room of Parkland Hospital that was answered by registered nurse Doris Nelson, who is on your ID sheet. And Mrs. Nelson was later quoted as saying, "The operator told me the president had been shot. I thought she was joking and asked her what else was new. But then, from the tone of her voice, I knew she wasn't kidding. She said the president's limousine was on its way to Parkland." Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is events shortly after the assassination. At 12:34 p.m., the United Press International, also known as the UPI, transmitted a 12-word bulletin around the world stating, quote, "3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas." At the same time, over the Pacific Ocean, in a Boeing 707 airplane, were several members of Kennedy's cabinet on their way to a trading conference in Tokyo, Japan. The plane carried Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon, Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, and Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs Robert Manning, who's on your ID sheet. The UPI bulletin touched off warning bells in the airplane, prompting a teletype message to members of the cabinet. Manning was actually sent to retrieve the message from the teletype machine, and he handed the news to Secretary of State Rusk. Once the cabinet was aware of the happenings in Dallas, Press Secretary Pierre Salinger spoke via radio directly to the Situation Room in the White House. Excuse me. His statements were as follows. "Please listen hard. The plane on which Secretary of State Rusk and other cabinet members are headed for Japan is turning around and returning to Honolulu. Will arrive there in approximately 2 hours. Any other information, please get as quickly as possible. Excuse me. For the next 30 minutes, there was nothing but silence on the airplane speaker system. Suddenly, after 30 minutes, a voice came over the speaker system on the airplane from the White House Situation Room to the airplane saying, "Wayside, stand by." 30 seconds later, "Wayside, stand by." 30 seconds later, "Wayside, stand by." And this message of "Wayside, stand by" again came over the speaker on the plane every 30 seconds for a period of several minutes. Meanwhile, the presidential motorcade actually reached Parkland Hospital from the assassination site at 12:36 p.m. One of the men who witnessed this horrific event was Dallas Trooper Milton Wright, who's on your ID sheet, who was riding in the fourth car of the motorcade with Mayor Cabell, and his wife. Wright's car followed the presidential limousine to Parkland Hospital, and Trooper Wright helped lift wounded Governor Connolly out of the limousine's jump seat and into the hospital. Wright was later quoted as saying, "As soon as we got him, Connolly, out, a Secret Service guy ran up in the car and pulled the president over to one side. I could see partially the side of his head was gone." Wright was then asked to help put President Kennedy on a gurney and then stood guard outside the hospital. Now, the president's body and the president himself was removed from the limousine after some protest from Mrs. Kennedy. Jackie refused to allow Agent Clint Hill to take her husband into the hospital, and Clint Hill pleaded with Jackie to let the agents take the president into the hospital. "Jackie, we've got to take him in. Mrs. Kennedy, please, we've got to take him in." And they really were stymied on why she would not allow the president to go into the hospital. Well, finally, Clint Hill figured it out. He realized the problem. He took off his sport coat, covered the president's bloody head. And then when he did that, so there wouldn't be a gruesome sight for people to see, Jackie then allowed Hill to remove the president and take him into the hospital. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who we had talked about earlier, who also followed the limousine to Parkland, was later quoted as saying the following: The minute the car stopped, the Secret Service rushed at Johnson and formed a corridor around him. I heard one of them say, "Mr. President," to Johnson, and I knew at that time that Kennedy was dead. That'll take us to our next subtopic, which is at Parkland Hospital. At the hospital, President Kennedy was rushed into Trauma 1, which is on your ID sheet, which was an emergency room at the hospital. He was immediately examined by attending surgeon, 34-year-old Dr. Malcolm Perry. Perry, with the help of Dr. Robert McClelland, and these names are on your ID sheet, immediately formed a tracheotomy in an attempt to improve the president's breathing. Perry performed the incision for the trach over the bullet wound in Kennedy's throat as Dr. McClelland held a retractor. Dr. Perry then began CPR on President Kennedy and was able to raise what was medically reported as a, quote, semblance of a heartbeat. Dr. Ron Jones had established an intravenous line in President Kennedy's left leg in the event that he had needed blood at the hospital. Dr. Jones also inserted a chest tube into the president. Agent Roy Kellerman, who was in the vehicle with the president, went into Trauma 1 to evaluate the president's condition. And once he saw the severity of the president's wounds, he hollered out to agents to get a telephone line to the White House immediately. Clint Hill actually secured the line and was talking to Washington on the telephone when he was interrupted by the operator at the White House. The operator stated that Attorney General Robert Kennedy was on the phone and wanted to talk to him. When Robert Kennedy got on the phone, he simply asked Agent Hill, "How bad is it?" And Hill was later quoted as saying, "I didn't know what to tell him. I really didn't know what to say. I simply said, it's as bad as it can get, to the Attorney General. Outside the trauma room, Mrs. Kennedy sat on a wooden chair. And according to Dallas Police Sergeant Robert Bob Duger, who was near the First Lady, he stated, "She asked me if I had a cigarette, and I said, 'I'm sorry, but I don't smoke.' She said, 'I have some cigarettes in my purse. Will you get them for me?' One of the Secret Service guys came over and said, quote, 'Get your hand out of Mrs. Kennedy's bag.' And she put him down pretty quick." After Dr. Perry's attempt to revive President Kennedy, it was obvious that the situation was hopeless. Finally, Dr. Kemp Clark, who's on your ID sheet too, who was the chief of neurosurgery, was the person who pronounced President Kennedy dead by saying, quote, "It's time to stop the resuscitation." Even though the president was dead at that time, there was a delay in the notification of death to honor Mrs. Kennedy's wish that a priest be allowed to give the president the last rites. So at 12:57 p.m., Father Oscar Huber arrived at Parkland Hospital with his assistant, Father James Thompson. Huber administered the last rites for President Kennedy and was later quoted as saying, "He was covered with a sheet, which I removed from over his forehead before administering conditionally the last rites of the Catholic Church." Mrs. Kennedy bent over and seemed to kiss the president. During this most trying ordeal, the perfect composure maintained by Mrs. Kennedy was beyond comprehension. I will never forget the blank stare in her eyes and the signs of agony on her face. In a low voice, she thanked me graciously and asked me to pray for the president. Father Thompson stated the following after the last rites were administered. "I went to the president's wife, took her hand, and in the best way I could offered my condolences. Having just left Parkland, suddenly I was aware that my right hand was sticking to the steering wheel. Then I realized I had the blood of the president on my hand. My God." At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. And after the president's body was placed in a casket, Mrs. Kennedy slipped off her wedding band, according to Sergeant Duger, who was now in Trauma 1. Duger stating the following: "She tried to put it on his ring finger, but it wouldn't go past the knuckle. She asked me to try, but I couldn't get the ring on either. We left it there on the first knuckle. I was having trouble with my vision, tears coming down. She cried just a little, then quickly gained her composure." At 1:05 p.m., back aboard the cabinet plane headed for Honolulu, the voice from the White House Situation Room changed from "Wayside, stand by" to "Wayside, Lancer is dead." Wayside was the Secret Service name for Pierre Salinger. Lancer was the Secret Service name for President Kennedy. So it went from "Wayside, stand by" to "Wayside, Lancer is dead." At 1:10 p.m., Kenneth O'Donnell walked 100 feet to a room where Vice President Johnson was being held. O'Donnell stated to Vice President Johnson, "The President is dead, Mr. President." The man who officially announced the death of President Kennedy was Malcolm Kilduff. Kilduff was the Assistant White House Press Secretary who was in Dallas because Salinger was with the other cabinet members on the trip to Japan. Kilduff then stated to Kenny O'Donnell, "Kenny, this is a terrible time to have to approach you on this, but the world has got to know President Kennedy is dead." O'Donnell's response to Kilduff was the following: "Well, you're going to have to make the announcement. Go ahead, but you better check with Mr. Johnson." As a result, Kilduff was the man who officially informed Vice President Johnson of the President's death. Even though Kenneth O'Donnell made that statement, he was still not officially given the word that the President was dead. Remarkably, when you think about it, Johnson was one of the last people who was at Parkland Hospital to receive official notification of President Kennedy's death. Kilduff asked Johnson for his approval to announce Kennedy's death to the public, and Johnson ordered that the announcement of the president's death be made only after he had left the hospital. And this is what Johnson told Kilduff. He said, "I think I'd better get out of here before you announce it. We don't know whether this is a worldwide conspiracy, whether they are after me as well as they were after President Kennedy." So after Kilduff received confirmation that Johnson was back on Air Force One at Love Field, he made preparations to announce President Kennedy's death to the press. The press was all assembled in a nurse's classroom at Parkland Hospital, and at 1:33 p.m., Kilduff stated the following to the press. Quote, "President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 p.m. Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound to the brain. I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president." At 1:38 p.m., as Vice President and Mrs. Johnson depart from Parkland Hospital, on national television, CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite announced the following to the American people. "From Dallas, Texas, the flash apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time a half hour ago. Vice President Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States." Cronkite actually had to stop and compose himself during this announcement. He was probably the most famous newspaper reporter of the time, maybe still is, very serious about his business, but even the death of the president choked him up. And he was later quoted as saying this about his historic announcement that day. "It is an interesting thing about us news people. We are much like doctors and nurses and firemen and police. In the midst of tragedy, our professional drive takes over and dominates our emotions. We move almost like automations to get the job done. The time for an emotional reaction must wait. I was doing fine in that department until it was necessary to pronounce the words that stuck in my throat. A sob wanted to replace them, a gulp or two squashed the sob, which metamorphosized into tears forming in the corner of my eyes. I fought back the emotion and regained my professionalism, but it was touch and go there for a few seconds before I could continue." You'll get a chance to see this announcement on video, and you'll see what we mean. Concerning Governor Connolly's condition, the news was much brighter. Dr. James Red Duke, who's on your ID sheet, was in charge of Governor Connolly's emergency care. A bullet had punctured the governor's lung and shattered his wrist. And actually, a senior medical student, Bill Scroggie, had stumbled on the governor unattended because of all of the attention that President Kennedy was getting. Well, Scroggie, who observed Connolly's respiratory distress, alerted Dr. Duke, whose immediate intervention saved Governor Connolly's life. Well, at 3:50 p.m., Dr. Robert Shaw, who's on your ID sheet, briefed the press on the condition of Governor Connolly, stating the following. "The condition of the governor is quite satisfactory in view of the injuries he has sustained. We believe he was in a sitting position, shot from above. We believe this is all one bullet." That ends the assassination of the president and the things that happened after the assassination and at Parkland Hospital. We will be talking now about the Zapruder film, which is a film, matter of fact, it was the only full recording of the assassination, and it was done by Abraham Zapruder, who was a dress manufacturer in Dallas. Zapruder had positioned himself on the top of a 4-foot concrete block on the grassy knoll overlooking Daley Plaza near the end of the motorcade route. He filmed the entire assassination with his Bell & Howell 8mm camera. And I have an exact copy of that camera I will show you. What set this up? The morning of November 22nd, Zapruder went to his place of business at the Dow Tex building right by Daley Plaza. It was right across the street actually from the Texas School Book Depository. And that morning, Zapruder first decided he wasn't going to take his camera to work, but his assistant Marilyn Sitzman, urged Zapruder to go home and get his camera so he could film the event of the president coming through Dealey Plaza to later show his children and his grandchildren. So Zapruder took her advice and went and got his camera. He then took Sitzman, making his way to Dealey Plaza. Zapruder unfortunately suffered from vertigo, and he would get dizzy when he was standing on an elevated ground. And because of that, Sitzman actually stood on the pillar with him to keep him from falling over while he filmed. Now, after capturing the entire assassination on film, a shaken Zapruder walked back to his office. Now, we're going to show you a video called Video, the Image of an Assassin, and we'll tell you kind of what happened after Zapruder realized what exactly he had filmed, because he basically saw the president shot twice and absolutely viewed the fatal shot and the most brutal shot, the third shot to the president's head. So we'll continue that later on a different lecture, but we will show you the film, the Zapruder film, in class if you get a chance to miss it. So anyway, that's the lecture on the assassination and Abraham Zapruder, an introduction to him. He is the only man, only person, and it's the only film that day in Dallas that shows the entire assassination in its entirety. And that film has been analyzed hundreds of thousands of times to try to determine what exactly happened that day in Dealey Plaza. Well, anyway, that'll take you through this particular material. You have the other video already posted, and this will be the assassination of President Kennedy. We'll have an exam on this particular bit of information after review, and then we're going to split up and tell you what happened after the assassination back in Dealey Plaza for another test material. Okay, that's it.